All right, so today we're going deep into the case of Jeffrey Paul Cutlip.
Yeah.
This guy, he was living this like double life, blending right into everyday society.
Right.
But behind it all, he was committing these truly horrific
Yeah.
crimes.
It's a classic case.
We've got a ton of sources here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like court documents, psychological reports,
Hmm.
news articles, the whole works, trying to piece together like who Cutlip was,
Right. Get a full picture.
yeah, and the trail of terror he left behind. We're talking about the murders of two women and a teenage girl,
Hmm.
all in and around Portland over almost 20 years, from 1975 to 1993.
Wow.
It's a really chilling case, and it wasn't until 2012 that he finally confessed and got life in prison.
So quite a long time for these families to wait for
Well,
justice.
absolutely. It's like it's mind-boggling how someone can just like live that way,
It's
putting on this like normal face for the world.
yeah, it really speaks to this idea of compartmentalization. These people can appear perfectly ordinary,
Yeah.
even charming sometimes.
Right.
But underneath it all, they're harboring these, very dark secrets.
It's like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation.
Exactly that duality. And we see it over and over again in these types of cases, unfortunately.
It's just like it's hard to wrap your head around, you
Yeah.
know?
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's get into it. Let's start with his early crimes.
Okay.
Our sources point to 1975 with the murder of Marlene Claire Carlson. She was 44 years old.
Mm.
And here's the crazy thing. Colette was actually living in the same building as her.
Oh, wow. So close to home.
I know, right?
Yeah. The sources describe how he got into her apartment.
Mm-hmm.
It was unlocked, and she was sleeping, and he attacked her.
It's terrifying to think about.
Marlene fought back,
Oh, gosh.
but he ended up strangling her with a telephone cord.
It's just brutal. And he was never even considered a suspect.
Right. They never even looked at him.
It just seems crazy considering he was right there in the building.
Yeah. And that really speaks to the limitations of investigative techniques back then.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Do you think that has to do with the time period?
Absolutely.
Like, was forensic science just not as advanced?
Oh, yeah. Back in the 70s, forensic science was, it's pretty basic compared to what we have today.
Right.
DNA analysis, for example, didn't even exist back then.
It's amazing to think how far we've come.
Yeah, investigators back then really relied on things like eyewitness accounts, fingerprints, very basic forensic analysis.
So you're saying that key evidence could have been missed just because the technology wasn't there?
Exactly. It's possible that they just didn't have the tools or the knowledge to properly analyze the evidence.
Makes you wonder how many cases could be solved today with all the advancements we have.
Yeah, and it really shows how important it is to keep looking at cold cases with fresh eyes.
Right. Using new technology, seeing if anything was missed.
Unfortunately for Marlene Carlson, though, justice was delayed.
Yeah, and this was just the beginning, sadly. Just 2 years later, in 1977, Cutlip claimed his second victim, a 15-year-old girl named Julie Marie Bennett.
15? Oh, my goodness.
It's awful.
Yeah.
The sources say that they met at Johnson Creek Park. Cutlip actually bought beer and cigarettes for her before taking her to his cabin.
That is just, it's so disturbing to think about. Taking advantage of a young girl like that.
Yeah, I mean, buying those things for her, that's like grooming behavior, right?
Exactly. That really points to premeditation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a random act of violence. He was planning this.
So they get to his cabin, and he rapes her and drowns her in the creek.
Ugh. It's just horrifying.
It's just awful. We're seeing a clear escalation here, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the fact that he targeted a teenage girl this time,
Yeah.
that's a big shift from his first victim. It could indicate a growing, preference for younger, more vulnerable victims.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, too.
Which really suggests a deeper psychological disturbance, in my opinion.
It's like he's getting more confident, more comfortable with his, his ability to control his victims.
Yeah, and that's a very scary thought.
And the worst part is, while locals suspected Cutlip, investigators thought Julie's death was an accident.
Oh, wow. So he got away with it again?
Yeah. They didn't have enough evidence to pin it on him, which allowed him to relocate.
And sadly, continue this pattern of violence.
Exactly. It's like one of the biggest challenges with serial killers is,
Yeah.
identifying a pattern early on. It's
Yeah.
often only after multiple crimes with similar characteristics that investigators can start to, connect the dots,
Yeah, they need those links.
And then, of course, it's a race against time to catch them before they strike again.
Absolutely. Every second counts in those situations.
And sadly, with Cutlip, this wasn't the last time he slipped through the cracks.
It's unfortunately a recurring theme in his story. Yeah.
All right, so in 1983, there's this incident in Washington state. This time, it's a kidnapping. He holds a woman hostage for several hours, but thankfully, he's finally caught.
Okay, so at least some accountability there.
But this wasn't just a random hostage situation. It was another example of his disturbing tendencies.
Oh, absolutely. This is where we see a significant escalation in his behavior.
Right.
He's convicted of sodomy and first-degree burglary.
So it wasn't just about holding her against her will. It was about power and control.
Exactly. And sexual violence.
Huh.
And he shows zero regard for the law.
And that's what finally gets him labeled as a sex offender, right?
Right. You would think that would have been a turning point, a moment for some serious intervention.
You'd think so. I mean, how many chances does someone get?
And this is where the whole issue of recidivism comes into play. You know, how effective is our justice system at actually rehabilitating offenders? Were there missed opportunities to intervene?
That's a question that haunts a lot of these cases, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. These are questions that plague the entire criminal justice system.
But even with this conviction, Cutlip's story doesn't end there.
Oh, no.
Just 7 months after he's released from prison, he strikes again.
Oh, gosh.
This time, it's 33-year-old Neeleen Lorabelle Dahl.
Another life taken.
And this one is particularly gruesome.
Oh, this case is really, it shows the darkest parts of Cutlip's personality.
Yeah.
So he met Neeleen at a bar, and they were using meth together.
Okay, this is where it gets really disturbing.
Right.
The sources say Cutlip asked Neeleen if he could tie her up for sex, and she refused. They struggled, and he ended up strangling her.
It's a horrific scene to imagine.
And it gets worse. After he kills her, he tries to sexually abuse her body.
Oh, my gosh.
Then he puts her in the trunk of her car, dumps the car in a Fred Meyer parking lot, and vanishes.
It's like he was trying to just erase her completely.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the meth use.
Yeah. Could that have played a role in this escalation of violence?
It's hard to say for sure, but there is a documented link between meth and violent behavior.
Really?
Yeah. Meth can trigger paranoia, aggression, make people more impulsive.
So it's possible it just amplified those tendencies he already had towards violence and control.
Exactly. Substance abuse is a huge factor in a lot of these cases, unfortunately.
So we're seeing this clear pattern of escalation with Cutlip, right?
Yeah, from his first murder to the kidnapping to this, it's a terrifying trajectory.
And sadly, this is just one chapter in his long and disturbing criminal history.
Yeah. The story, unfortunately, doesn't end there.
His case really highlights those challenges we face with repeat offenders, doesn't it?
It does. It's a story about recidivism, rehabilitation, and how we as a society deal with those who choose to harm others.
Okay, so let's dig into that in the next part of our deep dive into the life and crimes of Jeffrey Paul Cutlip.
It's crazy, right? Cutlip's story doesn't end there.
It's almost like a recurring nightmare.
Yeah, it's this frustrating pattern of going to prison, getting released, and then reoffending. It's really a sad commentary on the challenges our justice system faces.
For sure, especially when it comes to these violent offenders.
Yeah, and how do we rehabilitate someone like that?
Right, it's a huge question.
It is.
Like, it's just mind-boggling how many chances he got.
I know, right? You would think at some point...
You'd think someone would say, okay, enough is enough.
Exactly.
But it just keeps happening. So let's walk through this timeline because it really is kind of unbelievable.
Okay, so we left off in 93 with Neeleen's murder.
Right.
And just 7 months after he gets out of prison for that kidnapping, he robs 2 people at gunpoint.
7 months?
7 months. Back in prison for 6 years.
6 years for armed robbery. I mean, do you think that was enough? Considering, his history.
Sentencing guidelines, they're all over the place. You know, they vary by state, and there's so many factors that go into it.
But it's hard not to, wish for harsher punishments,
Oh, of course, of course.
Especially in a case like this.
Yeah. Ideally, sentencing should aim for this balance, right?
Oh, okay.
Punishment, for sure, but also rehabilitation.
All right.
And ultimately protecting society.
Right.
But did this sentence actually achieve that?
I mean, based on what we know now, it seems like a resounding no.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
So he gets out after 6 years. What happens next?
Well, in 2000, he gets paroled.
Okay.
And you probably won't be surprised to hear this.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He fails to register as a sex offender.
Ugh, of course.
And just disappears.
It's like the system is almost setting these guys up to fail,
Yeah, there's definitely a conversation to be had about how we track these individuals.
Yeah, especially the ones with a history of violence.
Right. Right now, the system depends on, Self-reporting,
Mm-hmm.
compliance, things like
But
that.
clearly doesn't work with someone like Cutlip.
Yeah, it's not very effective.
There has to be a better way, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe using tracking technology,
Okay.
enforcing those parole conditions more strictly.
That makes sense, but I guess that brings up a whole bunch of other issues too, right?
It does, yeah. There are definitely ethical and logistical challenges with that.
So Cutlip's on the run. What happens next?
Fast forward to 2004. Um,
Oh.
Cutlip wants to get his Social Security benefits back.
His what?
Disability benefits.
Seriously?
Yeah. So he comes back to Oregon.
He just, what, comes back?
Yeah, he comes back. Gets arrested, obviously.
Well, yeah, that was bound to happen.
But he's released that same December.
You can't make this stuff up.
It's unbelievable, right?
So what was the deal with that?
I don't know. The system is a mystery sometimes.
So then what? He's out again.
Yeah, for 6 months.
Oh.
Then he's back in prison for groping a teenage girl.
Oh, God.
Yeah. It just seems like, all those convictions,
Yeah.
prison time, nothing was changing his behavior.
It's like each time it's this missed opportunity to really step in and do something. Did no one see these red flags?
It's easy to say that in hindsight, but it does make you wonder.
Right.
So he serves another 2 years for that.
Okay.
Gets released again.
Yeah.
2008, he violates parole.
Of course he does.
Gets caught in Bakersfield,
California.
Another stint in prison, another release.
This is just crazy. It's like this revolving door.
Yeah.
When do we finally say enough is enough? Like, at what point does public safety just outweigh any hope of rehabilitation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like it.
It's a debate that just keeps going.
Yeah.
In legal circles, in psychological circles, everywhere.
There's no easy answer, I guess.
No, not really. Every case is different.
Right.
But Cutlip's story, it really forces us to look at this uncomfortable truth,
What's that?
that sometimes the system just fails.
Fails to protect the innocent.
Yeah, even when there are all these warning signs.
It's a scary thought.
It is.
But then, in 2012, in Texas, something totally unexpected happens.
Yeah, Cutlip confesses.
After all these years.
He finally admits to it all.
Wow.
It was shocking, really.
Yeah.
But it brought some closure to the families.
Oh, I bet. Can you imagine what they must have felt?
Oh, it must have been a whirlwind of emotions.
Relief, anger, just sadness.
Absolutely. I mean, it's decades late.
Way too late.
But it's something.
What makes someone like that confess?
That's a question that's been around forever.
Yeah.
It's a real psychological puzzle.
So what are, the theories?
Well, some people think it's genuine remorse.
Okay.
They just can't live with it anymore.
The guilt is too much.
Exactly. Others say it's about notoriety.
Like they want to be famous.
Yeah, infamous, really. They want their name to be remembered.
Wow, that's dark.
It is.
But it makes sense in a twisted way.
And then some people think it's just a way to manipulate the system.
Okay.
They think if they confess...
they'll get a later sentence.
Exactly.
So how do we know it's real?
That's where things like behavioral analysis come in. Psychological profiling.
So it's about looking at their behavior, their past.
Yeah. And really comparing the confession to the actual facts of the case.
So with Cutlip, we may never know for sure.
Probably not.
Yeah.
It could be a mix of all those things,
Guilt, wanting attention, trying to control the story.
It's possible. It's a haunting reminder, though, isn't it?
Of what?
Of how complex the human mind is, how much darkness there can be.
It's true. We may never fully understand what drives someone to do these things.
Nope.
But in the end, his confession brought some justice.
It did.
Finally, after all those years.
Cutlip's story, as messed up as it is,
Yeah.
it really gives us a lot to think about.
For sure.
About criminal behavior, about the justice system,
Mm-hmm.
about how hard it is to rehabilitate people.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
But important, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It forces us to look at these uncomfortable truths.
And hopefully learn from them.
Exactly.
All right, so in the last part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we're going to talk about those bigger implications.
Sounds good.
What we, as a society, can learn from this whole terrifying tale of Jeffrey Paul Cutlip.
Looking forward to it.
So we've been talking about Jeffrey Paul Cutlip and all the awful things he did.
Yeah, it's a tough case.
It really is. But what can we actually learn from this? Why is it even important to go back and examine all this years later?
I think, even though it's just one guy, one case,
Right.
it brings up all these huge questions
Mm.
that we as a society kind of try to avoid.
Yeah, like what?
Well, how effective is our justice system?
Right. Big question.
Really is.
Yeah.
How do we balance punishment with trying to actually rehabilitate people?
Yeah. That's something we've been talking about a lot.
Yeah. And then there's the whole issue of recidivism. How do we stop people from just going back to their old ways?
It's true. Cutlip's case, it really shows all of that, doesn't it?
It does. It's like a perfect example of these bigger problems.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the details of each crime, but when you step back,
Mhm.
you see this pattern over and over.
Exactly.
Violent offender gets released, commits more crimes, rinse and repeat.
And every time it happens, we have to ask ourselves, could we have stopped this?
Could we have done something different?
Right. And with Cutlip, there were so many warning signs.
Like tons of them.
Those red flags, like you were saying before, about the changing victims.
Yeah.
And that kidnapping.
Right. All those things point to a bigger problem.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we get better at seeing those signs?
And then what? Like, what do we actually do?
Well, as a society, as a system, we need to find ways to intervene that actually work.
Because it's obviously not about just locking people up and that's it, right?
No, clearly not. Cutlip went to prison multiple times.
Yeah. And it didn't change anything.
Exactly. We have to get to the root of the problem. Why are people acting this way?
Okay, so what are some solutions?
Well, we need to address things like substance abuse. That's huge. And mental health services, making sure people have access to what they need.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And when people get out of prison, we need to make sure they have support.
Like help getting back on their feet.
Right. Things like job training, housing assistance, all of that.
But then there's the other side of it too,
What's that?
keeping people safe. While we're trying to help these offenders, how do we make sure that other people aren't at risk?
That is the ultimate challenge, isn't it? Balancing those two things.
Because they seem kind of at odds with each other.
They do. They do. There's no easy answer, no magic solution.
So what can we do?
Well, we need better ways to assess risk.
Hmm.
Who's actually likely to reoffend.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like I was saying, those support systems are crucial.
Yeah,
Making sure people have a community to help them, to keep them on track.
that's huge.
It is.
Do you think we also need to maybe rethink how we view crime and punishment as a whole?
I think so. It's a tough conversation, but a necessary one.
It's easy to just want to lock people up and throw away the key,
Yeah.
but that clearly doesn't always work.
Nope. And honestly, I think we need a little more empathy. It's easy to demonize someone like Cutlip.
Oh, for sure. What he did was awful.
It was. But he was also a product of his environment, of a system that failed him.
And failed his victims.
Exactly.
Mm.
Empathy doesn't mean we excuse his actions,
Right.
but it means trying to understand how he got to that point.
It's about looking beyond the monster, seeing the human being.
Yeah, as flawed as they may be, I think that's where real change starts.
That's a good point. So as we wrap up this whole deep dive into Jeffrey Paul Cutlip's story,
Yeah.
what's the main takeaway?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that this isn't just about one man and his crimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's about us as a society. This case shows us all those cracks in our system.
Yeah, things we need to fix.
Exactly. It's about justice, rehabilitation, our own humanity, even the call to action, really.
To do better, to be better.
To look closer, to ask those tough questions.
And to demand better for everyone.
Exactly. For the victims, for the offenders, for all of us.
Well said. This has been a heavy one, but really important, I think.
I agree.
Thanks for helping us make sense of it all.
Of course. It was my pleasure.
And to you, our listener, we'll leave you with this thought. Jeffrey Paul Cutlip's story may be over, but this conversation, it's far from finished. Keep thinking about these things. Keep asking questions.
Keep pushing for a better world.
A world where stories like this don't happen anymore.
Thanks for listening.